Okay, so welcome to the third day of the course. Yesterday we started to discuss spectrum issues related to new networks and actually the different tools we can use to access and share the spectrum. And we also started to look into different kinds of bandwidths, right? So we saw there are actually bands that belong to the low frequency region like TV white spaces, and then we have the normal mobile cellular bands, we have unlicensed bands, as long as licensed bands. We have the new frequencies that are being considered for 5G, millimeter wave. So we saw there is a lot of diversity, both in terms of the bands and in terms of the techniques you can use to access the band, right? We also did a bit of initial, we also had a bit of initial discussion about spectrum sensing and how it can help to access new spectrum. And today we'll also start to consider other techniques, okay? So for example, a popular one, which has been suggested by FCC for the sake of spectrum sharing, is to use a geolocation database. Okay, so the principle is that some information about the incumbent or primary user or licensed, okay, I'm going to use these different words in an interchanging fashion, okay, interchangeable fashion. So some information about this primary system are stored in the database. This information could be, for example, the region where the primary is active or not active. Could be the bandwidth, okay, in usage, in use. It can be the power, for example, and what signal the primary system expects to have for its communication within a certain region. So that will define also what we call a coverage, like an exclusion zone for the primary. Other things can be the time of operation. So there are a few things, okay, that you can store in the database. So the main idea is that you come up with the pixelization, as we call it, of the environment, and basically within a certain area defined by the primary system requirements, we cannot transmit. So that's why in this figure, for example, we see that this pixel where the communication of the secondary user was supposed to take place, we basically color this pixel with red, right? On the other hand, if you are outside of the exclusion zone, we color it with green, because that means that here you're not disturbing the primary user. Now, there are a few issues how you basically come up with the best size for the pixel, and mainly it has to do with the trade-off between accuracy and complexity, as many times in our domain, in our telecom domain. So if you want to be more precise in defining this exclusion zone and maybe also more efficient in sharing the spectrum over a region, the pixel should be small, right? Because then you can shape the exclusion zone in a better way. On the other hand, there is a lot of information to process for the database, right? If you have a lot of pixels, because you have to collect all this information and take decisions. So eventually you don't want the pixel to be so small that it takes a lot of time to take a decision, right? You want also some flexibility. So there are some indications about the best size for the pixel. It could say something in the order of 100 meters, but it highly depends on the specific system, on the computational capability, on the mobility of the system. So there are a few considerations to make, okay? But in general, that's the concept behind exclusion zone and database. Okay, so there is a relation between how often the secondary systems, here we call them CR, cognitive radio. DB stands for database, PU stands for primary user or licensed user. So the more often you consult the database, the better you are coexisting with the primary system. So for example, here we see that there is like cognitive radio 1 and cognitive radio 2. So these are two secondary systems. You could think, for example, about two mobile operators that are accessing radar bands, okay, just to make an example. And for example, at this point, both systems consult the database, and they basically get no, in a sense, better put it here. So basically, they get no red flag, okay, no warning. So they keep transmitting, right, with time. And say basically there is a certain period where you consult the database. So for example, after a few hours, say about 6 in this example, Cognitive Radio 1 would consult again, okay, and Cognitive Radio 2 wouldn't. Cognitive Radio 2 would have double the period for consultation. So what happens here is that, say this is the time of the first consultation. At some point, primary user registers to the database, and it's going to say, okay, in this time, I'm going to be active, right? So since Cognitive Radio 1 has been consulting the database before the activation time for the primary user, you will see that by the time the primary user starts to transmit, the Cognitive Radio 1 system will stop transmission because it knows something will happen. Cognitive Radio 2, on the other hand, didn't do that. So for the Cognitive Radio 2, the picture at this point in time is still valid. It's not aware that primary user is going to transmit a bit after 18 hours. So it will clash, right? The transmission from Cognitive Radio 2 and primary system will experience a collision, right? An interference. So therefore, we have this like danger sign here, right? So you see that even in this simple illustratory example, it's very important that you define the right time to the right period of accessing information in the database. What is the right time? Again, there is a trade-off between accuracy and complexity. If you do it too often, you get a very accurate picture of the primary user operation, but you're spending all your time and resources consulting with the database. This is kind of control information, right? You don't transmit really. But if you never do it, then you are going to experience problems in the coexistence with the primary because you are not aware of the activity of the primary with sufficient time granularity. A more challenging scenario is when, for example, the primary is moving. So it could be the example of a airborne radar, right? So in this case, defining the exclusion zone is not trivial because you have a moving primary system, right? So the exclusion zone would move with the primary system. So what you can do to avoid troubles in this case is to define some margin of safety, some safety margin. Basically, you define some basic exclusion zone depending on the requirements of the primary system, but you add some margin so that you kind of accommodate, for example, the glitches due to speed, okay? And not all, not in all cases, I think you can be very precise with this. So that's one reason why, for example, the coverage, like the exclusion zones for naval radars are fairly big because, you know, the ships move. So it's very difficult, for example, to track, you know, to have a very clear picture of the movement sometimes. Of course, there are like routes and so on, but in general, they want to avoid troubles with these phenomena. So they tend to actually, in a sense, be conservative, okay? We are going to say that that's not necessarily the only solution. Okay, so one approach to spectrum sharing is what we call spatial sharing. Spatial sharing would be based on exclusion zones, which means if you are not within my exclusion zone, we can share the spectrum, right? You're not going to disturb me, and that's fine. What is a smarter approach? It's what we call temporal sharing. Temporal sharing means we are going to share actually the spectrum within the same region, potentially, just not at the same time. What I mean is that imagine you have a rotating radar. Okay, normally radars follow very regular patterns, right? They scan a certain region with a certain, we're going to go back to this, but with a certain regular like movement. So basically, you have to be careful when transmitting if you are a secondary cognitive radio system only when the radar is pointing at you, because that's when you would interfere, right? But in any other situation, you don't have to care too much. You can even be very, very close to the radar, because as long as the radar is pointing somewhere else, then you're good to go, right? So, and we're going to see an example, a few more examples about this. But the idea is that if you are aware of the transmission characteristics of the incumbent, you can do a much better job. Okay, and therefore, if you can inform the database also with this information, not only saying this within this radius something happens, but like more adding directionality, for example, information, and adding information about the antenna scan pattern and so on, you can do a much better job in sharing the spectrum. Okay, we are going to see actually very big gains later on based on these considerations. Yes.
I don't know that what you're saying is the airborne radar and the shipborne radar. You see the shipborne radar, usually ship moves at a very, very slow speed. You can easily predict. Number two, half the side will be the water.
Correct. Correct.
Even if the ship is docked somewhere,
yes.
half the side will be water.
That
makes things.
That's true.
Easier for you. And airborne radar, usually there are two types of radar. One is the height finding radar, and the other one is the weather radar. So weather radar, as such, is not looking in your direction; it is primarily looking up. So far as height finding radar is concerned, so strictly it looks down, right down. And the airborne radar, what we say is the AVAX, early warning system. Very few countries have. Very few countries. So probably 6 or 7 countries
right.
They have this technology.
So
I don't think the airborne radar as well as the naval radars, they will be creating much of problem.
Right.
It is the terrestrial radar, which are probably on the ATC air traffic control or weather radar. They are the ones.
Yeah,
spectrum is
right.
readily available for you. So far as military radars are concerned, they are not going to,
yes.
do any sort of transmission.
I think I've been touching a few interesting points. Okay, first of all, there is, I mean, as it transpires, actually, even from your intervention, there are a lot of different radars. Okay, they are not all one thing. There are some commonalities, but there are also many differences. So I think one challenge when you want to design a general mechanism to detect the spectrum occupancy in a radar band is this. There is not a one-size-fits-all, but unfortunately, it's also impossible to design a secondary system for each specific radar. You cannot do that, right? So it would be too complicated, right? You want something simple for your system. So you have to find a trade-off, I think. So you'll try to get some general understanding of radars, so some things will be common somehow to radars. For example, one thing that is common to all radars is the duty cycle is low and the signal to noise ratio is very high, right? So these are things that are common to all radars. So it's not that they are disturbed too much, right? Unless you're really like close to them and you're really pointing in the same direction of transmitting. So in a sense, it's easier. I agree with you. On the other hand, there is some resistance, at least definitely from military organizations. And in general, of course, there are genuine concerns about traffic safety, air traffic safety. So what we're trying to say here is that without impacting in any way, the safety, we can accommodate, transmission of commercial applications. So, of course, this is research. There is the policy dimension. We cannot comment too much on that. It's very important. But our main goal here is to try to convince these people, I mean the radar people, that they're not going to lose anything. If anything, they might gain some compensation, or maybe military don't care. But there has to be, of course, an intervention from the policy makers to enable this. So the government has to support this. Of course, if not, you know, that's you're not going to sneak in the radar band and use it, right? You cannot do that. One thing, though, we have been collaborating and taking measurements with the Navy in Ireland. Okay, so we have been taking measurements in their naval base in the south of Ireland. So there is, at least they're ready to discuss. Okay, so, and they've been kind enough to allow us to, you know, take measurement of the radar transmission. So for scientific purposes, I mean, I think they are willing to at least collaborate. What's in it for them, I can't tell. Okay, I'm not working for the Army or the Navy, but at least they've been attending also a workshop we organized on spectrum sharing. There are people from the defense, actually. I think another thing is, I agree with you totally that, you know, it shouldn't be that big deal for them, but practically, that we share the spectrum, but practically, the way the exclusion zones are designed make it a big deal. Even though, as you say, although the transmission is not, for example, if you have a coastal radar, you shouldn't care about what happens in land, right? But practically, the way they designed these exclusion zones, we're going to see a picture later, it excludes large part of the coastal population from using that band. So even if you could share it, you would just share it inland, not close to the coastline, where a lot of the big cities are. Like even if you look in India, you have Mumbai and Calcutta, which are very close to the coast, right? And US is even more extreme, right? All the big cities are along the coast. So the way it is designed right now, as per regulation, it's very, very restrictive, okay? So one thing we're trying to change is to show, look, you can still get all you want in terms of your quality of service, but, you know, we can also get something. So it is a tough struggle, but, you know, what I saw, for example, with cognitive radio, nobody believed it in the beginning, more or less, at least, well, academia did, but not industry really. And now in a different form, it's happening, like this LSA, PCAST in US. It is an example that things are eventually making it into the standard and the system. So it might be not in 5G that we see, you know, this radar band sharing. Might be in 6G, but I think, you know, if you have solid evidence and you keep talking with the right people, things will happen. I think definitely the governance, the administration of a country should be kept in the loop, because unless you have the support of the government, this is not going to happen, of course. So there are some actually elements that relate the database specifically and the radio environment. So depending, for example, on the you know, dynamics of the let's say on the mobility of the primary system, you will actually have some impact on the temporal sharing opportunities. Depending on the aggregate interference, you will have different spatial like sharing opportunities. Depending on how many actually primary users you have to let's say depending on how many primary users you have to monitor, say for spectrum sharing, you will have a more complex database. You know, time dynamics and mobility will also impact complexity. So there are more details. Actually, I don't have time in this short course to go into this. We have a paper which appeared in the IEEE Communication Surveys and Tutorials. It's very comprehensive. So what we did there, we really mapped 3 different kind of bands: cellular, radar, and TV white spaces. We basically mapped it with spectrum access techniques. So we did kind of a matrix where you have sensing, cooperative sensing, database, and beaconing, and we see for each band which one is actually the technique you should use, and depending on, you know, the specific characteristics of the band, you should pick one or the other. Radio environment factors are like basically they are characteristics of the electromagnetic environment, like interference, multipath, you know, mobility. So one thing we actually learned by doing this study, first of all, is that the promising band to look into its radar for many reasons. It is a lot of band available, a lot. I mean, I'm talking definitely something in the order of a gigahertz, in the sub 6 gigahertz band. So the people claim that you should go into millimeter wave. They have a point. So you can get a lot of band, but the point with radar bands, you don't even have the complications of millimeter wave, right? You use a band which you know all about. It's about, you know, the band you've always been using, very long propagation range. So it's a good band, okay? So if you can arrange the sharing with radar system, it's still worth it, additionally to the millimeter wave story. Other good characteristics of radars, the low duty cycle is very inefficiently used. Okay, it's very easy to detect signal, high power, and it's also a signal you can disturb less with because of this high power, right? So it's not like, you see, if you do sharing between, say, cellular systems, basically you have a difficulty in sensing, and also you can easily disrupt the operation, right? Because the powers are lower, much lower. But a radar would transmit probably with powers, I guess, in the order of megawatts, stuff like this, right? So it's hugely powerful compared to base stations which probably use 20 watts or something like this. So it's not the same game we are playing, right? So, but I think the main reason to look into radar bands, it was also novelty. There's been a lot of work in let's say, inter-operator sharing, low band sharing, TV white spaces, but very little work has been done so far in radar sharing. So I think my team is one of the first actually that looks thoroughly into this. There is another team in Virginia Tech, Professor Clancy, Ted Clancy, I think is the name. And you know, they are, no, I might be wrong with the first name, but it's definitely Professor Clancy, and they are doing actually a lot of work in this, but not too much else is going on. Okay, so if any of you is interested in pursuing spectrum sharing, dynamic spectrum access, cognitive radio, my suggestion is try to look into radar bands, because there is a lot of work to do there. Okay, it might be actually, you know, you also have to find a way to distinguish yourself from the other researchers, right? And this is also a way to link your problem to specific setup. So not cognitive radio in general, with systems you don't know what they are, and bands you don't know what they are. Here you know the band, you know the primary, there is a real problem, there is a real advantage. You can define your secondary, it could be a mobile operator. So in a sense, you know, the problem is well defined. Then you have to go into the specifics and identify what would be new about your approach, what to do. But you know what I'm trying to say here is that you should always tie it to a real problem and to real information. Okay, then you can actually talk to people from the weather radar, for example, and get some real data. So these things you can do. I think this is a better way to approach spectrum sharing than an hypothetical system in an hypothetical band, right? So with solving an hypothetical problem. So you really have to go real if you want to do impactful research. One good thing we saw, we also published another couple of conference papers. These are highly cited. Probably some part, it might be the part of my work which is most highly cited at the moment. So people care about this because it's kind of, you know, it's kind of a unique piece of work. Not many people are doing it, and it solves a very relevant problem. So if you do that, it also impacts your H-index, citations, and your profile. So it's scientifically, it's a better contribution, I think. Yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail. So in the paper, there is going to be a very thorough analysis. So you're going to see a lot of these tables and this mapping between, you know, the techniques and the environment and the bands, and it should give you a better understanding of the situation in spectrum sharing and you know, new directions for cognitive radio. So it's a good read. Okay, regardless of this specific course. I would recommend, if you're interested in these problems of spectrum sharing and cognitive radio, to have a look, because I think it's a useful paper. Just to mention a few things about cooperative sensing. Some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might be less familiar with it, but the idea is basically that you have different sensors collaborating with each other. And in a nutshell, the main idea is that you have, I mean, you are in a situation where you have a primary system transmitting and secondary systems like cognitive radios, which have to decide whether there is activity on the side of the primary. And for example, if you just have one sensor and the sensor is in the unlucky position that is basically, you know, is shadowed because of a wall or any obstacle, it won't realize that something is going on, right? Because at some point this might be too weak to be detected. So maybe you say, okay, probably say 0, nothing is going on, like a 0 hypothesis, right? No transmission. But if you have an allied, like another sensor in your, you know, system, it might be not shadowed, right? And it will tell you, hey, wait a minute, this is not H0, this is H1, something is going on here. Now you might have the more sensors, the merrier in a sense, because you can actually come up with a good statistic, right, of the situation. And then there is a problem of how you convey the information, how you process it. So there are different rules to decide. The most basic ones are the end rule. You take a decision that there is spectrum activity, there is activity in that spectrum only if all the sensors say so. The OR rule is more aggressive. You say, or well, actually, if you take in terms of detection, more conservative, you basically say there is activity only if one sensor, at least one sensor says so, okay? So if you want to be, in a sense, reckless, you say, okay, until all my sensors say something is going on, I transmit as a secondary. If you want to be very conservative, you would use probably a no rule. So it's enough that one sensor tells me so, and then I stay put, right? And there are a few other things like majority rule and some more. Okay, so the idea is basically that you get a picture of the primary transmission based on multiple sensors. Now, I have a question for you. What do you think is the underlying assumption so that cooperative sensing will give a benefit? What should happen about the sensors? I mean,
They should communicate with each other.
true, but there is something else. So when do you benefit really from multiple sources of information?
When they are actually apart.
Yes, there has to be some degree of independence, right? Because if they are all exactly at the same place, then they will all tell you the same, right? So, and that doesn't help. On the other hand, you see, it's a bit gray, the area, not really black or white, because you do want some correlation to be sure, right? Because if they are completely independent, well, again, you won't learn too much, right? It's like when you summon witnesses for a trial. You want different people, so they will have different, you know, angles, but you want some coherent story, right? So when they start to contradict each other, then you have a problem. So again, here actually I did some work in the past, not very recent, but we did explore this space, right? So there has to be some correlation, but not too much. Okay, you have to find the right balance between some coherence in the story and also some diversity in the measurements.
But those two cooperative radios that are sensing
Mhm.
the primary user's transmission, and now when they are talking to each other, they are also talking to each other through wireless medium. So if we consider that those are the opportunity radios, they have to get a free spectrum to communicate between each other itself.
Correct.
So let's say like when they are talking to each other, which spectrum they will communicate in that? In the primary spectrum where primary user spectrum, they will, where they transmit, or they will use some another spectrum to talk to each other.
Right. I think this has to do with what we call in-band or out-of-band sensing. So, you know, you could have actually either a standardized channel where you do these kind of things, like what they call, I think, cognitive pilot channel, sort of, or you could do it within the band itself. In that case, of course, you have to make sure that there is enough separation, this spatial separation, or, you know, for example, you could have an uplink and a downlink band, you know, but you have to have a way to separate the primary transmission from the sensing, right? And by the way, also it's beyond that, because you do have also the secondary transmission going on, right? So there are three things. There is the primary transmission, secondary transmission, and the sensing. So all of these things should be carefully coordinated. So that's why some people have been proposing this kind of universal cognitive radio channel where you do these things. I think it didn't pick up because it requires a huge amount of effort in standardization, and it's very complicated to implement. You do prefer probably the in-band solution to some extent. It's an interesting piece of work. Now this is very much frame design oriented, and it would require some links to standard bodies. So this it starts to be a bit outside of the research scope because it's very much linked to a specific standard and so on. But it's definitely something that few people have considered. So it is a relevant problem.
The band that they are choosing, let's say, they will try to communicate by using a good choice of power levels so that it does not interfere with the primary user.
Yeah, it could be one solution, or it could have like spatial separation. Now, power and space are more or less the same thing, right? So you can play with that. I think you could define like specific frequency assignments for this within the secondary, I guess, or you could. This becomes actually. This becomes a problem of Mach for sensing, right? And again, I did a bit of work in the past, not recently, but there is work about Mach protocols for sensing, right? This is not the real Mach in a sense, but it's the Mach you do to enable the sensing. And you can have centralized and distributed architectures. There's many things you can do. It's an interesting area. I think though, it's probably not new kid on the block kind of thing. There has been work, okay? So, and the work I did dates back to 2008-9. So you see, it starts to be kind of long time. I'm not fully aware of the developments. I suppose there are many solutions out there. It might have been considered for some standards also, some specific, things. Now, normally what I see though is that the standards normally don't go into this detail. So they might tell you what they want, right? The requirements, okay? But they would leave this open also to enable competition, right? Your company that does, say, sensing would come up with a better algorithm. They would not disclose, of course, the thing because their business. And then they would, if they do better than somebody else, they would, be doing better in business. And I see that, for example, with scheduling in general. You're never going to find a specific scheduling recommended in a standard, right? They would tell you, roughly speaking, how the system should interoperate, so the frame structure and so on. But when it goes to the specific algorithm doing the thing, you will not find it because that would hinder competition, right? So you have to be really an insider in the company to know about it. But companies don't publish these things, of course. It's their business, right? So they patent the stuff and then they keep it for themselves. Okay. Yes.
Suppose there is a situation where CR2 is sensing the primary user and CR1 is not sensing the primary user. But if CR1 transmits at the frequency of primary user, and suppose we are considering the case where they are using some beam. So, and it will in no case will interfere with the primary user.
Yes.
And CR2 is saying no, you cannot transmit because CR1 no, you cannot transmit on that frequency.
No, I think this is more meant to. Yeah, I understand your point. I think you have a valid point, but this is more the case where you want to know whether there is a primary at all, right? So what you have to understand that this is like support network, in a sense, if you want. In this case, at least they're acting as sensors, right? It can be even an external third-party network, or it can be your mobile phones, but it's not just this mobile phone you care about, it's the region, right? So you want to know within a certain region whether something is going on or not. Then, depending on that, you might have beamforming, you might have different arrangements. I think here we are not even assuming beamforming. So, but the point here is more, if you just rely on CR1 for a certain region, you will get a biased picture, right? But you are perfectly right that depending on the actual, for example, geometry of a space and the capabilities, you can do better. And we do have an example later on of application of beamforming to radar sharing, radar band sharing. So we definitely looked into that. It's a relevant thing. But here it's more like, you know, you cannot just trust one sample, right? You have to get multitude. Yes.
So when the CR1 and CR2 are moving, so will it not be too much difficult to manage these things because the mobility is involved?
Yeah, but normally I would suppose that you are more concerned with the primary mobility, right? So I think yeah, you're right, but it would become too, why would you have the sensors moving? I think what could happen is that the primary would move, and then you would have sensors in different places that would report, right?
Sensors can move, they are also used, so they are also.
Yeah, but they don't have to. That's my point, right? So it would have complication. I agree. I think, you know, in a sense, you have to think of this sensing network as enabling other communications. It's not communication per se. This is like control, right? You want to get an idea, so you have to make it easy for yourself. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, the primary will move, and you have to cope with that. But you don't have to make it hard for yourself, right? I think sensor networks are supposed to be relatively static unless there is a need to move. I don't know, maybe you have only few sensors and the primary is moving, you have to track the primary. I don't know. Okay, I didn't consider that, but here it's really the idea to understand whether there is activity or not. Okay, and if you can do it with a simpler solution, better. So maybe it's easier if you just deploy all your sensors in an area, and then when the primary moves, you know, they will activate, let's say, in this region, something is happening, and maybe in another region, but you wouldn't have your sensors moving all over the place. I don't think you need that.
These sensors are basically enablers of
Yes. On the other hand, you're right that if you talk about an LTE network, already some sensing is happening, and the users move. Again, though, you have some location information in new systems, right? So you would know where your sensor or user doing sensing picked up that information, right? You know where. So the mobility is as big a concern as it is normally. So I don't see the sensing adding complication. That's, you see my point. You have any way to deal with mobility to transmit to your users. So you have to know where they are to some extent, especially if you have like directional transmissions in millimeter wave, like tracking is a big thing. On the other hand, sensing is just another thing. But, I mean, your mobile phone is already doing sensing, whether you know it or not. So it's already sending back information about the signal strength and stuff like this, right? So this would be adding to the interference if you want. So already you have a measurement in LTE telling you about the interference. Okay, so you just pick up a higher interference, therefore, okay, there is a primary, but you know, its mobility is not it's not a problem that adds. It's already there, and you are solving it anyway. Yes.
We're talking about primarily two bands. One is the like military band, availability of military band, and one is the that license band or the commercial band, the one which are being auctioned. So any specific data available that because if we keep military band aside, just try to analyze how much spectrum is available, usage of spectrum is there in the commercial band. Any data available with you?
In the commercial band.
Exactly.
So how much it is used? I mean.
How much it is used? That's still the cognitive radio.
Yeah,
it doesn't allow us to use military band.
Correct. No, there are studies definitely. I showed, I think, figure yesterday where that's kind of old, 2008, but you know, in the main, I suppose it still holds. So they were showing for the band from 30 to 300, sorry, from 30 to 3000 megahertz, the occupation. It was usually less than 25%. Yes, over time. Yeah, so it's not much. There might be studies. I think that was kind of the original motivation for cognitive radio, right? There were studies around the mid of the 2000 showing a lot of these things. I don't have actually data I can share about the radar bands, but what we no, but you could get some collaboration going on. So, for example, we have been talking with some military guys. They are open at least. Now it depends on the country and the service, but there might be some possibility to get some information. Now, I think a tricky part there is that before they collaborate to you, they want to have some guarantee, right? So there has to be an involvement of a policymaker. You cannot knock the door of the army and say, tell me how much you're using your spec. It doesn't work that way, right? We know that. But our main message is that, yes, it's fine. You can share better the spectrum in the commercial bands, fine. TV white spaces, you can use them. But the real big deal in lower bands, okay, sub 6 gigahertz, is radar bands. There's a lot of them. They are not very much used. So this is true, no matter what they tell you. Now, the concern might be we need it because of national safety, air traffic safety. I agree with it. But they cannot tell me with a straight face that they use it 100% of the time. It's not even true for busy bands. Those are not busy bands. Okay, that's the case. In fairness, it has already happened a bit with some not impressive results in the 5 gigahertz band. Wi-Fi is already doing some sort of sharing. They have this dynamic frequency selection capability. Something has happened. Okay, and the FCC, the regulator in US, has been suggesting in a report in 2012 that was written on behalf of the Obama administration that they recommended to share the 3.5 gigahertz band, which is naval radar band in US, with small cell, so with a 4G kind of thing. So it is there. I mean, there is at least, some people are open, and we have been talking with the Navy. So my original assumption was impossible. Nobody will listen to you, but in fact, it's not really like that. Okay, so there is actually possibility at least to be heard, and scientifically, it's probably one of the two big things you could do spectrum-wise. The other one is millimeter wave. Now the problem, again, I suppose one of the things you want to get out of this course is some possible areas for your investigation. Millimeter wave starts to be crowded. Okay, there is a lot of work. Even if you just consider the system level, Mach, it starts to be very hectic. I don't see a huge activity yet in spectrum sharing in radar bands. So there is still work to do. If you are interested in a cognitive radio spectrum sharing, dynamic spectrum accessing, it might be worth a look. Then you decide for yourself. You might have different opinions, but if you are really interested in the spectrum sharing band, I would say the next frontier in the next 5 years is this. It's radar bands. Based on, I think a good outcome of this paper was exactly that. Okay, so we realized that was worth a try, because a lot of work has been done in other bands. Okay, and this is relatively unexplored. There might be reasons for that, of course, but it's sort of new. Okay, there are more information. This is a nice picture. So this kind of tells you what we did in this paper, and you do have different bands, you do have different access techniques, and the main question we try to answer in this paper is which is the right spectrum access technique for a certain band. And then based on this, we decided to tackle radar bands, and we started to do more detailed research on that. Okay, so that's where we are now. I think these are all things that are very specific. So there are considerations about cellular bands. We can maybe see a few examples, just not to skip entirely the thing. So, for example, so there is a color code in these tables, where of course it's like the traffic light convention. Green is good. Yellow is caution, red is bad, right? So for example, a bad thing about cellular bands, so we're talking about cellular bands now, is that there are a lot of transmissions going on. It's not like radars where you have one radar now and then, right, in space. Cellular systems are everywhere, a lot of base stations, a lot of users, downlink, uplink, many frequencies. So it's a very difficult technology. It's a very difficult band to sense. Another bad thing I would say about these bands, they have been very much the focus of a lot of research. They're really not the band that is least used. They are sufficiently used. So it's difficult to claim that you need to, is the first band you should look into if you need new spectrum. There are better bands, very easier bands. I think cellular bands are less promising. There's been a lot of work anyway, so I think it's kind of difficult to justify research nowadays in for example, inter-operator sharing. There's been a lot of work in the last 10 years, basically. So it's I think that's one of the reasons why we decided not to be working in this during this time. Yeah, if you have basically to this uplink and downlink separation is important for the reason I was discussing before with Sandeep about doing in-band sensing. So you have to have a way to separate your sensing related communication from your real communication, right? So for example, since FDD is there, basically as the de facto duplexing choice in cellular networks, you could use uplink band for sensing and downlink for transmission and vice versa, right? The point is you have a way to separate these two communications. Yeah, there is a hidden receiver problem, which is not really a big deal because you have a two-way communication, and for example, base stations are very easy to detect, so somewhat not so severe. So there are many considerations. So this is like a summary, but in the paper we go into a lot of detail about each of these considerations. You see this in-band and out-of-band cognitive pilot channel is what I was discussing before. So there's been some discussion about that. The problem, this is like about, so before we were discussing about in general about the radar bands, the cellular bands. Yeah, any comment? No. And now we are discussing about a specific technique, the beaconing, so embedding some information into the transmission of the cellular system so that it helps the secondary system to be aware, right, of things. So you kind of help the secondary system by encoding some information in your own transmission. Now, this is a problem because it basically, you see, in this case, it impacts the infrastructure. You have to change a lot of your system to do that, and that's costly. So beaconing in general, I think it has been considered, but it doesn't look to me really a way forward because it has been there since the beginning of cognitive radio. If you read the first cognitive radio papers, you would always have these three possibilities: sensing, database, and beaconing. Beaconing looks to me the one that stands the smallest chance of success because it implies a tight degree of cooperation between primary and secondary and a lot of changes on the primary side. It's like, the primary is not only has to share the band with you, it also has to change its own system so that you can access it. That would be too much, right? And definitely no chance this is going to happen for radar systems. You're already lucky if you get to use the band. No way you can tell the army or the airport authorities to change their own system because so that you can use their band. That would be too much, right? So I'm a bit skeptical that beaconing is really going to make it. It might have some limited applications, but it won't be the mainstream solution for spectrum sharing in the future. I don't believe so. Yeah, so there are a few radar bands which are of interest. So first of all, it is a significant portion, okay, of the band. So you do have, for example, bands between 960 and 1400, 2700 and 3500 megahertz, and then 5 giga up to 5.85 giga. You can do the math. Summing, we are probably reaching something that is 2 gigahertz. Okay, so it's a lot. Okay, so these are the bands, the millimeter wave people brag about, right? They say we have gigahertz of bands. Now, the problem with millimeter wave is that it's short range. It implies change in technology. You have to have very powerful beamformers active, very much impacted by movement, by movement of users. by obstacles, expensive RF. These are all problems that you have when you use millimeter wave bands, but you don't have at these frequencies. We have been working in these frequencies forever, right? We have systems. So this won't change anything in terms of technology. So you see, now the challenge is of a policy nature. You have to convince the incumbents to share, right? And we agree with that. But technologically, not a big deal, you know. So not as big a deal as millimeter wave, and the same band potentially. So that's why I'm saying, you know, and egoistically, you also have to think about topics that will make you stand out of the crowd of researchers. Not many people are working in sharing in radar bands. Okay, so give it a thought if you're interested in spectrum sharing. So the good thing also is that the challenge in radar bands is not so big in terms of enabling spectrum sharing, technological at least. So you do have an occupancy which is sparse, so you don't have really a lot of activity normally in space, time, and frequency. The radar system are placed far apart because they want themselves to avoid interference, right? I mean, you have to consider this is not about sending a picture to your friend or to your partner. This is about safety, right? It's about detecting a possible enemy activity. It's about avoiding planes to crash. It's about, well, maybe weather, not always a big deal, but for example, in countries like India, where you have monsoons, right, you have storms, it's important to be kind of accurate, right, the way you predict the weather. Definitely in US, right, with hurricanes. So even weather forecast can be a big deal. So you don't want to be approximate, right, about these things. You want to be very precise. So they place themselves far apart so that they don't interfere with each other, and therefore their quality of service is good. So that's good for us because that means, you know, in the same space, if you place things more far apart, you have less systems to track. There's not so many radars you have to worry about. The antennas are very directive and rotate over time. Two good things. Very directive, right? So we kind of know, well, related. So the antennas are directive and rotate. What does it mean? It means that unless I'm exactly aligned with your transmission, I mean, with the radar transmission, I won't interfere, right? So potentially, if you take it at the limit, just in one direction, there will be a problem. In infinitely many more, you won't have a problem. Of course, you have to know when, right, this happens. You have to be able to detect, but potentially, you could have a very simple thing. You just, you know, have an energy detection. When the radar will point at you, you will have a huge surge in the energy because the radar systems work with very high power. Again, because they want to be precise, right? It's very much safety oriented, so they cannot have problems. So they really have operational SNRs which are very, very high. Definitely above 20, 25 decibel, I think. Okay, so it's easy for an LTE phone to pick that up. LTE works up to minus 15 dB. So it's a joke, right, in terms of difficulty. And the fact that they rotate, it implies that you could potentially be very close, even co-located almost with the radar and not interfere, right? Because as long as you're not clashing with the transmission in that specific direction, you won't disturb the primary system. Other characteristics, well, there are a few kind of radars, but mostly you see them in coastal areas, airports, right? So they're tracking like ships, planes, you know, and you know, even for defense, right? I mean, especially for a country like India, the border is pretty much water, right? So you do have a lot of radars then along the coastlines, and also for commercial navigation, right? Stuff like this. Some of them, though, might be placed on mobile platforms. An example, military ship, right? They have radars. I mean, because they have to detect again enemies and, you know, and other things, and they move, right? So it might not be always so trivial to get to know this. I mean, it is trivial if you have the route plans, but you might not have that, right? So if you are a secondary system sharing, why should the army tell you about it's very sensitive information, right? They might not tell you what they're doing with their warships, right? Of course, they will never will. So you have to have a way to be able to detect mobile targets. Very low spectrum efficiency. Duty cycle is very, very low. So we are talking probably 5% or less. So most of the bandwidth, sorry, this is like more, they are not using their bandwidth in a very efficient way, but that's also related to the fact that the duty cycle is very low. Okay, they are not really active most of the time. Yes. This is like, as far as I'm aware, these are the bands where radar systems are active. I'm not saying a specific radar system, but there is some radar activity in the band from 960 to 1400 megahertz, and then around 3 gigahertz, and then around 5.
So now targeting for that yellow color spectrum.
Sorry?
We take the concept of spectrum sharing. So we are targeting for the 960 to 1400 megahertz.
You're targeting for any spectrum, but you know, if you want to share radar spectrum, these are the bands that you should look into, because that's where you have radar operations. Okay, so these mostly radars. I mean, there are other things also, but mostly it's. I mean, there's also Wi-Fi here, right? But definitely there are radars operating in these different bands.
I think actually the 960 to 1400 not only for radar, because normal communication is also happening in that band.
No, okay, this is not, don't take this number, take these numbers with a grain of salt. It's an indication. Of course, there is much more granular, right? You have a lot of services and sometimes other services, I agree. What I'm saying only here is not only radar, but also radar, okay? Might be only.
How will get that free spectrum from that band?
I think, you know, for example, if I'm thinking about 5, there is already some coexistence between Wi-Fi and radar, but Wi-Fi are very local, right? So if you are outdoor, you want, you know, you will just see the radar. Other examples, let me think. I think most of the systems I can think of are fairly local. I mean, either you have your own band as a licensed operator, so it's like wide area, but then you are the only one transmitting there. Okay. If I think about radar bands, again, normally these systems are the only ones working there. There might be some exceptions, okay, but in the main, if there is a band used by a radar, the radar is the only system there, okay? So I don't think there is, you know, I'm not saying exactly these numbers, but more or less within these regions, there are parts of the spectrum which are only used by radars, I think, okay? I don't know the specifics, okay, but I know that definitely if a radar system is active in an area, unless it's a very local application like Wi-Fi, I don't believe they would allow a lot going on, right? That's the main deal for them. They want the spectrum to do their stuff. So again, with a grain of salt, the main message is that there is a lot of band which is not efficiently used by radar, okay? And that's what we want to target when we want to share the spectrum with mobile broadband. Okay.
Actually, generally we are calling it the radar band.
Yes.
But actually in the radar we will use only particular frequencies.
Yes.
But remaining throughout the spectrum,
Yes.
other equipments will use that in the radar band also.
Yeah,
That if we
correct.
If we want to use the spectrum, you will get only few megahertz spectrum of it. So whichever radar using the particular frequency only we can use it.
Right, but I think there are many radar types. So I didn't do the math of summing in all the different bands, but I think it's not just one radar.
It's not a spot frequency type, so there's some spot frequency, HDD and hopping.
Correct. So they do move, right? Maybe you're right. Maybe it's narrowband at a specific time, but it's also for defense purpose, right? You want to be secure. Yeah. Yeah.
Radar only spot frequency there, but other communication equipment full hopping they will do actually.
So you're saying that there are other systems that are doing.
Systems are there.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Total the L-band systems will operate in the band.
Right.
And then the hopping systems are there, spot systems are there.
Right.
And some only
Yeah.
only
Look, in a sense, okay. So when you do, I take your point. I think it's not so clear cut. Okay, there are a few systems and so on, but the main point here, you know, in cognitive radio, you don't care too much, in a sense, about how many are there, okay? As long as you identify an opportunity, you use it. I think our main, of course, you have somehow to simplify the problem. We cannot identify a general spectrum sharing where we take care of all the possible systems. Here we focus on radars for some reasons, and our main concern here is to show that if a radar system is active there, we won't interfere. Now, it might be, as you say, there is another system, and then we have to take care of that. But you see, you cannot solve all problems at once. I agree with you. For example, I think an example of this Wi-Fi in the 5 gigahertz band, probably not a big deal. So if your main focus is to provide mobile broadband, that's not what you compete with. It's not the competition with Wi-Fi. Because Wi-Fi is more maybe static broadband, right? You don't move that much. So in that case, it wouldn't be much of a problem. In other scenarios, you have to see case by case, and then, but if your system works for radar, it could work also for other coexistence, right? In any event, the general concepts of sensing, spectrum agility still apply, okay? But here we are focusing on a specific problem. So if there is a radar system in a certain band and area, how we coexist. When you go into the commercial production, and so on, then other considerations might be there. What I can tell you is that we did consider what was done before in the 5 gigahertz band, and it doesn't really perform that well. So this dynamic frequency selection adopted by Wi-Fi ended up really underestimating the problem and creating interference. So they didn't do a very good job with it. It's very static. I mean, so.
Actually, now in mobile point of view, we are thinking about the radar bands. At the defense point of view, they are also doing research on cognitive radio concepts.
Yes.
They are also searching in their own bands.
Yes.
So wherever the radar transmission is not there, they want to use it different purpose, the same frequency.
Correct.
So they are licensed for that band. So
Yes.
they want to use themselves for it. Then now,
Of course. No, but that's the main problem of cognitive radio, right? It's not just radar bands. That has been there since the beginning of the.
so they are doing research
Yeah.
on their own band, whereas the spectrum modes are
Yes.
there.
Look, this is definitely a multi-stakeholder situation, right? So you do have the operators that want more band for their own services. You do have the radar bands, the radar, operators. Of course, they have their own reasons. So we have a biased take, right, on this. I mean, you are researchers, but researchers from the commercial telecom viewpoint. We are not military people, right? So of course we will have a bias. I think radar operators will have a bias. That's natural. I think that's why if you want to progress any further with this, you need at some point to take aboard the regulators, the government, because only then you will have some possible agreement. Otherwise, the military people will say something and academia will say something else, and then there is no possible agreement. I think what makes me hope that there is a way forward, despite what military people say, no way. Okay, there are some military people that is open to discuss. I mean, I met some, and now FCC is normally very influential in our field. Whenever FCC says or does something, more or less the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the Western world, follows. So FCC has been vocal about sharing the naval radar band at 3 to 5 gigahertz with commercial applications, with small cells specifically. So since they said so, something is boiling in the pot. I think it's not so black or white, but I agree it's not the easiest of scenarios. There are, though, very good points to consider it. Okay, so there might be now one problem is that with other bands you could come up with the financial compensation. Military normally have enough money; they don't care. There are other things, okay, but not you cannot say I give you some few 100 crores and then I use in your band. One word, they don't need the band. They don't need the money. They have money, okay. So and their concern is of another nature. So I think that doesn't apply. It could be, as you say, since there is activity on cognitive radio. I know they are also designing more. Like there is the basic version of the radar, is the magnetron, but they have better radars now, right? So I think much of the technology we do is agnostic, right? So it could be applied to your system. So if we design a better system, it could benefit, military systems as well. So there could be a win-to-win situation, but the default assumption is don't touch it. I know that, okay? And therefore, I think, yeah, you can show results. We're going to show results that it might be possible, but definitely eventually the regulator has to step in. If the regulator says no, then there is no point.
Is there any standard protocol established for sharing the primary to secondary?
In radar bands, you mean? Not that I'm aware of. I think this is still pretty much a research topic. There are, I mean, the main groups I'm aware of, might be wrong. There is something going on in Virginia Tech, in Trinity College. There might be a few more, but not an awful lot. So this is still early stage of research. I don't think this is even very much in the agenda of 5G. Not really. I think. Yeah, I would not say 5G people are normally talking about this band, so it's still in its infancy, which is good for research. But there are issues to do with, you know, practical realization. Again, following the trend of cognitive radio, maybe not in the full-fledged paper, research paper version, but, you know, something might happen eventually. I don't think it will solve all your problems of spectrum demand with millimeter wave. I think this is bound to complement it a bit. And again, Wi-Fi, they allowed it. So maybe not for the LTE outdoor, but for the LTE version of you know, small cells. And Wi-Fi did a very sloppy job, right? So we can do better than that. So maybe you could, for example, replace these systems with femtocells, which actually would disturb even less the radar. And it's already there, so you cannot say no, because it would help you. You see, so in situations, you mentioned other situations of spectrum sharing already. That's good, because, you know, I'm pretty sure that 5G can do a better job in many respects, you know, for spectrum sharing, because it's very advanced, very dynamic, very intelligent. So if you are happy to share with the basic system, you shouldn't have problems sharing the same band with a more advanced system, right? Because it would be to your I don't know if you're in the army, but, you know, to the army's benefit. So I think, you know, to make a deal, you have to be two. Okay, that's the thing, and you need probably a kind of you know, referee, right? So I think if there is the will to discuss and there is a referee involved, like, which is the government, might make some progress. And I think there are some low-hanging fruits, you know, like. So maybe not the full-fledged full band sharing, but maybe in some, you know, bands there can be some possibility. And of course, maybe actually the currency which academia can pay to you know, to the radar incumbents is better technology, because I know that normally the defense does good work in research, but, you know, so does academia. So, you know, if you join forces, you might find actually a beneficial interaction. And, you know, you can acquire technology which you can then use for yourself. I mean, we are open to these discussions, actually. And we have been, yeah, as I said, we've been in touch with the Navy in Ireland, so there's something going on. I don't think this is going to be in the next swathe of 5G systems. Probably will take a bit longer, but you might start to see some prototypes maybe in the early years of next decade. You know, so it might be something going on in the next few years. Okay, so I suppose we are basically ready for a break. Any last question or comment? Yes.